The following is a transcription and reconstruction. The source materials are a government case file, reference number 7741C, which was classified at the level of internal review in 1979, and which was partially declassified under a Freedom of Information request in 2019, at which point it was discovered that certain sections of the file contain documentation that the originating agency could not account for, documentation that did not originate with the agency, that did not match any known government format from the period, and that described phenomena for which the agency had no classification category. Those sections were not reclassified. They were, according to the FOIA response, quarantined, which is not a standard government classification category, and which the agency did not explain further when asked to explain it further. The quarantine sections are the basis of this account. The non-quarantined sections, which are the majority of the file and which describe the agency's actions, and the subject circumstances in the ordinary language of 1970s government documentation, are also part of this account, because the quarantined sections cannot be understood without the non-quarantined ones, and because the ordinary language of the non-quarantined sections is itself a document of a specific kind of harm, which is the kind that uses the apparatus of the state to transform a private person into a public symbol without their consent and without their protection, and with the specific violence of a political machinery that never once asked what the person thought about being used for the purpose they were being used for. The person was Vera Cobb of Chicago, Illinois. The purpose was the destruction of the political will to fund public assistance programs for the poor. The entity was something older than the purpose and something that the purpose summoned, and that pursued Vera Cobb from 1973 until 1979, when the file ends, and that the file does not fully account for, which is why the relevant sections have been quarantined rather than released, and which is why this account exists. This is the file on Vera Cobb. These are the things the file contains. Section 1. Background and acquisition of subject from the non-quarantined sections of File 7741C. Formatted in the documentary style of the originating agency. Original language preserved where possible. Subject: Vera Cobb née Williams. Born March 14, 1939, Memphis, Tennessee. Relocated to Chicago, Illinois, 1961. Current residence: address redacted, South Side, Chicago. Occupation at time of file opening: home health aide part-time. Recipient of federal assistance under the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program since 1968. Mother of 4. Widowed 1967. The file on Vera Cobb was opened in October of 1972, which was 14 months before she was told the file existed, which was 4 months before she was told the file existed, which was in the specific order of these things in the 1970s federal bureaucracy. 2 years before she was told the full extent of what the file contained and what the file had been used for. The file was opened by an office within a relevant federal agency. The specific office and agency are redacted in the declassified version, at the request of a political communications office that was, in 1972, in the process of developing the messaging architecture for a policy agenda that required a specific kind of public villain. Not a real villain, not a person who had done anything criminal or anything harmful to anyone, or anything that warranted public attention of any kind. A symbolic villain, a figure around whom a political narrative could be constructed that would allow the dismantling of federal assistance programs to be presented to the American public as a moral necessity rather than a political choice. The figure needed to be a woman. The figure needed to be black. The figure needed to be a recipient of public assistance. The figure needed to be photographed in circumstances that could be presented as evidence of misuse of public funds. Circumstances that, in the visual language of the period's political communication, would communicate to a white American electorate the specific message that had been workshopped through multiple focus groups and multiple rounds of internal political testing, and that had been found, consistently, to activate the specific resentments that the political agenda required to be activated. Vera Cobb's file was identified through a data matching program that cross-referenced public assistance records with a set of criteria that had been developed by the Political Communications Office. She met all of the criteria. She was the 93rd woman whose file was identified as meeting the criteria. She was the one selected. The selection was not based on anything she had done. It was based on what she looked like and where she lived, and the fact that the census of her block and the aerial photographs of her neighborhood and the specific combination of her physical characteristics as visible in her public assistance application photograph met the criteria that the Political Communications Office had determined would produce the response they needed from the electorate they were trying to reach. She was selected in October of 1972. She was not informed of the selection. From the private journal of Vera Cobb, entries for November-December 1972. The journal was found in the subject's apartment during the building inspection of 1973 and reproduced in the file. The file's reproduction of the journal entries does not include a warrant or legal authorization for the journal's acquisition. This gap in the file's documentation is noted by the agency's own internal review in 1975 and attributed to administrative error. November the 10th, 1972. Cold today. Marcus had a cold last week and now Darnell has it. Took the afternoon off from Mrs. Petrov to sit with them. She was annoyed. I told her I'd make up the time Thursday. I probably won't have time to make up the time Thursday, but I'll try. The AFDC check was 2 weeks late this month. I called the office 3 times. The third time a woman told me there was a processing backlog from a system upgrade, and it would be resolved in 2 to 4 weeks. I asked her what I was supposed to do in the 2 to 4 weeks. She told me to contact my local church or community organization. I thanked her and hung up, and then I sat in the kitchen for a while. I have been sitting in the kitchen for a while a lot this fall. I don't know what that is exactly. Not depression. Something more like paying attention. Like I'm sitting in the kitchen listening to the apartment and the apartment is telling me something I haven't understood yet. Roosevelt used to say I had a feeling for the unseen. He meant it affectionately. I miss him. November the 24th. Something is watching the building. I know how that sounds. I don't have a better way to say it. For the past week, maybe 10 days, I have had the feeling when I come home in the evening that something is in the street below the apartment. Not a person, or not only a person, something in addition to the ordinary street. I stood at the window for a long time last night, and I couldn't see anything specific. And then I looked at the lamp at the corner of the block, and the light of the lamp was doing something it doesn't usually do, which was casting a shadow that didn't match anything I could find on the street that would make that shadow. A shadow the wrong shape for anything I could see. I watched it for 20 minutes and then I went to bed. I have not told my mother about this. She would know what to do about it, and I'm not sure I'm ready to hear what she would say to do. December the 3rd. I told my mother. She was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then she said, "What did you do to draw attention?" I told her I hadn't done anything as far as I knew. She said, "It doesn't have to be something you did. It can be something done to you. Something that pointed in your direction and didn't know what it was pointing at." She asked me if I had any enemies I knew of. I said not that I knew of. She said, "Then something is using your name without knowing you." She said, "I'm going to make some calls." She didn't explain what calls. My mother has been making calls that she doesn't explain for as long as I can remember, and they usually turn out to be useful. December the 8th. The photographer. A man with a camera photographed me this morning outside the apartment building when I came out to take Darnell and Marcus to school. He wasn't hiding. He was standing at the corner of the block with a camera with a long lens. I looked at him and he took the photograph and walked away. I don't know who he was. I called the building manager, and the building manager said he hadn't seen anyone and I should call the police if I was concerned. I did not call the police. From the non-quarantined sections of File 7741C, Internal Memoranda, Memorandum dated December 9, 1972, from redacted to redacted, Ray. Subject 7741C, Photographic Acquisition. Photographs acquired this date, 11 in total. Initial assessment. Subject presents well for intended communication purpose. Recommend proceeding to Stage 2. Memorandum dated January 15, 1973. From redacted to redacted. Ray. Subject 7741C, Press Coordination. Photographs distributed to coordinated press contacts on January 12. Placement confirmed in 4 regional publications for the week of January 22. Nationwide wire distribution of Associated Narrative briefing scheduled for January 29. Subject has not been contacted or notified. Per our previous discussion, notification is not required under current operating procedure. Section 2. The public deployment from the personal account of Vera Cobb, written in 1981 and submitted to a civil rights legal organization as part of a formal complaint. The complaint was not pursued due to statute of limitations issues. The account is quoted here in full where relevant. I found out in February of 1973. A woman I worked with, Mrs. Lena Patterson, showed me a newspaper. She came to the apartment on a Sunday afternoon with the newspaper folded to an inside page, and she stood in my kitchen while I read it, and she didn't say anything while I read it because there wasn't anything appropriate to say. The article was about government waste. The specific form of government waste the article was about was the AFDC program. The article described, in the language of outrage, a woman in Chicago who was, the article said, receiving multiple benefit payments under multiple names for children that may or may not exist, who was living in what the article described as relative comfort on the taxpayers' money, who represented a broader pattern of abuse of a system that was costing the American public billions of dollars and producing nothing but dependency and fraud. The woman in the article was described in terms that would have identified her to anyone who knew her, but that were vague enough to avoid the specific legal exposure of naming her directly. The photograph accompanying the article was not vague. The photograph was the one taken outside my building in December. It was me. I was carrying Marcus on one hip and holding Darnell's hand, and I was wearing my good coat, which was a coat I had bought at a sale in 1970, and which was, by the standards of 1973, a reasonable winter coat, and which in the photograph looked like the kind of coat the article wanted to describe, which is to say it looked like the coat of a woman who had money she shouldn't have. I was receiving one AFDC payment for my 4 children. I had not received a benefit payment under any other name. I had never fraudulently claimed anything from any government program. I had never met the journalist who wrote the article. I had never been contacted by the newspaper. Nothing in the article that pertained to my actual situation was true. I sat in my kitchen with the newspaper for a long time after Lena left. I thought about what my mother had said in December. Something is using your name without knowing you. Something that pointed in your direction and didn't know what it was pointing at. I thought about the shadow under the street lamp in November, the shape that didn't match anything visible. I thought about the photographer at the corner of the block. Then I called my mother. From the file's internal surveillance log, February-December 1973. The surveillance log documents 17 instances of subject monitoring in the period February to December 1973, including photographic surveillance on 9 occasions and observation of the subject's movements and contacts on all 17. The surveillance log does not document the legal authority under which the surveillance was conducted. A 1975 internal review noted this gap and recommended that documentation of authorization be added retroactively, which is not standard procedure, and which the internal review's recommendation acknowledges is not standard procedure while recommending it anyway. The surveillance log also contains, beginning with the entry for March 14, 1973, the earliest of the quarantine sections. The entry for March 14, 1973, begins as a standard surveillance log entry, time, location, subjects observed activities, and then mid-entry shifts to a different register in a different handwriting, smaller and more compressed than the standard log hand, in the margin of the page. The marginal notation reads, "If you're enjoying this journey into the mysteries, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover more hidden secrets, haunted stories, and thrilling tales just like this one. Don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now and turn on notifications." There is something on the block that is not part of our operation. I have been conducting the March 14 observation since 800, and at approximately 1215, I observed something at the far end of the block that I cannot account for. It is at the periphery of my observation point. When I look directly at it, it is not there. When I do not look directly at it, it is there. I have been in this work for 11 years, and I have not written anything like this in an official log, and I am writing it now because I think it should be in the file even if I don't know what category it goes in. It is at the far end of the block, and it is watching the subjects building with a quality of attention that I do not have words for. I would describe it as patient. I would describe it as something that has been doing this for a long time and intends to continue doing it. It does not appear to be aware of my observation point. I do not think it can see me. I think it can only see her. This notation does not appear in the original typed log. It appears only in the handwritten annotation. The annotator's identity is not documented. From the personal account of Vera Cobb, 1981. My mother came up from Memphis in March of 1973. She stayed for 2 weeks. She came because of what I had told her about the shadow and the photograph and the newspaper, but also because of what she had found out through the calls she had made in December, which turned out to be calls to people who knew about this kind of thing in the way that people know about things that are not officially knowable. People in the tradition that my family came from, that my mother's mother came from. That goes back further than any of us can trace, but that has been in our family, and in the families of people like us, as long as anyone can remember. The knowledge of what happens when a certain kind of force is directed at a person, and what that force attracts if it is strong enough and sustained enough. My mother's name was Rosalie Williams, and she had been in the tradition since she was old enough to be in it. And she was not a woman who made things more dramatic than they were. And she was not a woman who found supernatural explanations for ordinary events. She came up from Memphis in March of 1973, not because she thought I was imagining things, but because she had made calls to people who confirmed what she had suspected in December, which was that what was following me was real and that it had been summoned. Not deliberately, because the people who had summoned it had no idea they had done so, had no idea such a thing could be done, were entirely innocent of any knowledge of the forces their actions had set in motion. The summoning was the byproduct of the attention, the mass public attention directed at my image, my face, the story they had built around what they called me, the specific concentrating force of millions of people's resentment and contempt directed at one face, one body, one woman, my face, my body, me, except that none of it was actually about me. None of the contempt or the resentment or the political machinery that produced it had anything to do with the actual Vera Cobb, with the woman who sat in the kitchen paying attention and worked for Mrs. Petrov on Thursdays and was raising 4 children. None of it was about me, and all of it was pointed at me, and in the tradition my mother came from. That kind of pointing, that kind of concentrated direction of force, had a name, and what it attracted had a name, and the name was old and it was serious, and my mother did not use it casually. She sat in my kitchen for 2 weeks and she did the work she had come to do, which was not dramatic and not visible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at, which is the nature of this kind of work. It is quiet. It is careful. It is the work of hands and of specific materials arranged at specific thresholds, and it is the work of attention, which is the same attention that the apparatus of the state had deployed against me, but applied in the opposite direction, which is toward protection rather than exposure. She put things at the thresholds. She told me what to say in the mornings before I left the apartment. She told me what to avoid and what to seek, and what to do if I felt the following. And she described the feeling precisely, the cold that is not weather, the sense of the margin of vision occupied by something that disappears when you look directly at it. She told me the one thing that mattered above everything else, which was not to respond to the attention, not to look at what was following me, not to acknowledge the scrutiny, not the state's scrutiny, not the newspaper's scrutiny, not the political machinery's scrutiny. She said, if you respond to their looking, you become more visible to it. The looking is the food. The being looked at, the being made the subject of the looking, is what feeds it. Don't give it more. She went back to Memphis, and I tried to do what she had said. Section 3. The escalation of the deployment and the escalation of the following from the non-quarantine sections of File 7741C, Political Communications Memoranda and Press Placement Records. Between February 1973 and June 1975, the subject's image and the narrative constructed around it appeared in 47 separate published pieces, newspaper articles, magazine features, 1 television news segment, and 2 political speeches that referenced the narrative without naming the subject, but that described circumstances that anyone familiar with the earlier coverage would recognize. The coverage collectively reached an estimated 40 million readers and viewers. The file contains a reach-and engagement analysis that uses the specific language of political communications, penetration, saturation, recall, applied to the face of a woman who had not consented to be the subject of any of this, and who had no legal recourse because the coverage, while false, was not technically the kind of false for which legal recourse existed in 1973. The subject did not sue, because she had been advised by a lawyer at a community legal clinic that the costs of litigation would exceed any likely recovery, and that the coverage had been constructed carefully enough to avoid the specific elements that would constitute a winning defamation case. The subject did not make public statements because she had been advised by her mother to not respond to the looking, and she did not. She continued to go to work for Mrs. Petrov. She continued to take Darnell and Marcus to school. She continued to sit in the kitchen in the evenings and pay attention. The quarantine sections of the file from this period document what the surveillance logs and the marginal notations of the observation team recorded during their monitoring of the subject. The observation team had been expanded in 1974 from 1 individual to 3, a standard expansion for subjects receiving elevated media attention, and all 3 members of the expanded team produced marginal notations that were, in the standard review process, flagged for the quarantine section. The notations, across a period of 18 months, describe what the observation team encountered in the course of their surveillance. The notations are consistent across the 3 separate team members, who did not, according to the file's internal documentation, communicate with each other about their individual observations. Team Member A, notation dated October 1974. The subject left her building at 730. I was positioned at my standard observation point on the opposite side of the block. At approximately 745, when the subject was approximately halfway along the block, I observed that the subject appeared to be walking in a way that suggested she was aware of something behind her or beside her that was not visible from my position. She did not turn. She did not increase her pace. She kept her eyes forward, and her posture was, I am going to use a word that is not standard in a surveillance log, composed. The composure was effortful, the kind of composed that costs something to maintain. I have observed subjects for 11 years and I know the difference. She was working to not look at something. I looked from my position at what she was working not to look at. I have written a separate account of what I saw at the margin of my observation point and given it to my supervisor. My supervisor has placed it in the quarantine section. I am noting here that the account exists and that I stand by it. Team Member B, notation dated February 1975. Standard observation, 16:0-1800 hours. Subject returned home at 17:12. As subject entered the building, I observed that the building's entrance cast a shadow that was inconsistent with the position and intensity of available light sources. The shadow was at the entrance before the subject reached it. It was not the subject's shadow. I relocated to get a better angle on the entrance, and the shadow was no longer visible from the new position. I returned to the original position, and it was present. This has happened on 4 separate observation sessions. The shadow is visible only from a specific angle. I have consulted with Team Member C, and Team Member C has made the same observation from a different position. We have agreed that the angle from which the shadow is visible is the angle from which the subject would be able to see it if she looked directly at it. She does not look directly at it. Team Member C, notation dated June 1975. I have been conducting observations on subject 7741C for 8 months. I have produced standard surveillance reports for each session, and I have placed the non-standard observations in the quarantine section as instructed. I am writing this notation in the standard log as well as the quarantine section because I want a record in both places. I want to say plainly that I believe the subject is aware of something that has attached to her as a result of the attention the program has directed at her. I believe she is managing it, or attempting to manage it. I believe she is doing this with a knowledge of how to do it that is not knowledge I have, and that she has not shared with anyone documented in this file. I believe the thing she is managing would like to harm her, in the specific sense that a thing that feeds on attention would like to consume the source of the attention, and that she is preventing it from doing this by a means I cannot describe in this log. I want the record to show that I have been conducting this surveillance for 8 months, and that I have noted what I have noted, and that my view, for whatever it is worth, is that the appropriate response to what I have observed is not more surveillance. My supervisor has told me to continue the surveillance. I am continuing the surveillance. From the personal account of Vera Cobb, 1981, I knew they were watching me. I had known since December of 1972, since the photographer at the corner, and by 1974 I had identified the observation point from which the team watched the building, which was not a difficult identification, because the team was not particularly skilled at concealment, and because I had spent 2 years developing the specific quality of attention that my mother's tradition required, which made me better at seeing things at the periphery of my vision than I had been before all of this started. I knew the difference between them and it. The surveillance team was human and I could see them directly. The thing that followed me was not human and I could not see it directly, which my mother had told me was diagnostic. If you can see it when you look at it, it is a person. If you can only see it when you do not look at it, it is the other kind of thing. I want to be clear about what it was, because I think the clarity matters, and because I think the people who read this account, if they read it with the right frame, will understand the clarity as important rather than as the evidence of instability that the people at the relevant agency seem to have taken it for when they encountered it in their surveillance logs. What followed me was not a ghost. It was not the spirit of a dead person. It was not a demon in the theological sense that the word demon usually means. It was something that had been summoned by the specific act of making me the object of mass public contempt. The concentrating of millions of instances of resentment and fear and prejudice onto one face, one woman, one body, with the specific political intention of converting private prejudice into public policy. It fed on that attention, and the attention was so large and so sustained and so deliberately concentrated that what it fed on grew large and sustained and concentrated too. And what had been following me was, by 1974, something that I felt in my body every day. The specific cold of a thing that wants something from you and that has learned to wait. My mother had told me not to respond to the looking. I had not responded. I had not given interviews. I had not written letters to the newspapers that published the articles. I had not sought out the political figures who had used my image. I had not looked at the shadow under the street lamp, or the shadow at the building entrance, or the shape at the margin of my vision on the daily walk to the bus stop. I had composed myself every day, every walk, every time I felt the cold of its attention, and I had kept my eyes forward, and I had said what my mother had taught me to say, and I had not looked. The composure cost something. I want to say that clearly, for the record, because the composure is not the same as not feeling it, and the not looking is not the same as not knowing it was there. And the maintenance of the discipline of the tradition is real work in the specific sense of work that takes from the body what it takes. I was tired in those years, in a specific way that was not the tiredness of Mrs. Petrov's Thursday hours, or the tiredness of 4 children and a household managed alone. It was the tiredness of sustained, daily, effortful not responding, of being watched by the apparatus of the state, and by the thing the apparatus had summoned and finding, each day, the resources to not give either of them what they wanted, which was different things, but both of them wanted something from me and I was not going to give it. I held on. I held on because I am my mother's daughter, and because my mother is her mother's daughter, and because the tradition I come from is the tradition of holding on under conditions that are designed to make holding on impossible. And the holding on is not passive, and it is not the absence of resistance. It is the resistance, the specific form of resistance available to a woman in my situation, which is the refusal to be made by the looking into the thing the looking is trying to make of me. Section 4. The withdrawal of the deployment and what followed from the non-quarantine sections of File 7741C. Internal Communications, 1976. By 1976, the Political Communications Office had determined that the narrative constructed around Subject 7741C had been sufficiently disseminated and had served its purpose in the public discourse. The decision was made to withdraw active press placement and to allow the narrative to persist in the public mind through the organic continuation of the coverage cycle, which was expected to produce a diminishing return of coverage over an 18 to 24-month period as the news cycle moved to other subjects. The surveillance of the subject was scheduled for de-escalation in March of 1976, with full withdrawal by December of 1976. The internal communication documenting this decision notes that the operation had achieved its objectives and that continued allocation of resources was not warranted. The communication does not note the quarantined sections of the file. The communication does not address the observations of the surveillance team. The communication was written by someone who had not read the quarantine section, or who had read it and found the appropriate response to be what it had always been, which was to allocate the quarantine section to its own file and to continue with the operation's standard conclusion procedures. From the personal account of Vera Cobb, 1981. In the summer of 1976, something changed. I noticed it the way I had learned to notice things at the periphery without looking directly, in the quality of the cold rather than in any visible sign. The cold was different. It had been the cold of pursuit for 3 years, the cold of something at the margin of my vision moving in the same direction I was moving. In the summer of 1976, it became the cold of something that had stopped. Not stopped following me, stopped being fed. I called my mother. I said, "I think the attention has reduced." She said, "The looking has moved on." I said, "Does that mean it goes too?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "It means it is hungry." I said, "Hungrier than before." She said, "Yes." She said, "Hungry things are more dangerous than fed things." She said, "Keep doing what you're doing. Don't look at it. Don't respond to it. But know that it is going to be closer now, because the supply has been cut and the demand has not." She was right. In the autumn of 1976, when the surveillance had been reduced to a single team member conducting weekly rather than daily observations, I felt it at the threshold of the apartment for the first time. Not on the street, not at the margin of the block, at the threshold. The specific cold of it pressed against the door. My mother's workings were at the thresholds, and they were holding. But they were holding against something that was pressing harder than it had pressed before. And holding costs what holding costs. And I was running a calculation every day about how long the workings and my own discipline and the tradition's protection could continue to hold against something that had been fed for 3 years and was now consuming what was left of that feeding at an accelerated rate. I wrote to my mother every week during this period. Her responses were in the tradition's specific combination of practical and spiritual that I had grown up with: what to maintain, what to renew, what to add at the thresholds, what to say in the mornings. She did not come up from Memphis again because the traveling was difficult for her by 1976, and because she trusted me to hold what she had taught me to hold, and I held it. I held it, and in the winter of 1977, the pressing at the threshold reduced. I cannot tell you why. My mother's theory was that the gradual withdrawal of the mass public attention, the coverage cycle moving on, the political narrative shifting to new subjects, the millions of instances of resentment redirected to a new face, a new story, that the withdrawal of the feeding was starving it in a way that my sustained non-response was compounding, that it could not sustain itself on the residue of 3 years of concentrated attention when the attention itself had been withdrawn, and that my refusal to give it the fresh attention of my own response was completing the starvation. I don't know if that's right. I know the pressing at the threshold reduced in the winter of 1977 and had stopped by the spring of 1978, and I know that by the spring of 1978 the cold at the margin of my vision was gone, and I know that by the autumn of 1978 I could walk to the bus stop without composing myself against the cold, which was a freedom I had not had for 5 years, and which I marked in the way that I marked important things, which was to sit in the kitchen in the evening and pay attention to the absence of the thing that had been there, and to recognize the absence as the thing it was, which was a return to ordinary. My mother died in 1979. The file closes in 1979. I do not know if this is a coincidence. Section 5. What the file KNOWS and what it does not. This section is not from any part of file 7741C. It is from the account of the researcher who worked with the file in 2020 after the partial declassification. The file on Vera Cobb is one of, by the researcher's estimate, several hundred similar files produced by the relevant agencies during the period of the operation's activities. The researcher did not have access to the other files, which remain classified. The researcher does not know whether the other files contain quarantine sections, though the researcher considers it probable, given what the quarantine section of file 7741C documents, and given what is known about the scope of the operation. What the file knows is what the apparatus documented: the selection of a private citizen for the purposes of political propaganda, the surveillance of that citizen for a period of 7 years, the construction and dissemination of a false narrative, the monitoring of the effects of that narrative on the target and on the public discourse, and the withdrawal of the operation once the political objectives were achieved. What the file does not know is what Vera Cobb knew, what her mother taught her, what the tradition she came from had developed across generations of living, with exactly this kind of force directed at exactly this kind of woman, the specific and practical and deeply serious knowledge of how to not be consumed by concentrated public malice, how to hold at the threshold what presses at the threshold, how to sustain the discipline of non-response against something that is using your face and your name, without your consent, to feed something that neither you nor they fully understand. The file does not know this because the file was not designed to know this. The file was designed to document the subject from the outside, from the apparatus's perspective, which is the perspective of the looking rather than the looked at. The apparatus documented what it saw and what it measured, and what it could account for in its categories, and what it could not account for it quarantined. And what was quarantined was the evidence that the subject had a knowledge the apparatus did not have, and a capacity the apparatus could not measure, and a tradition the apparatus could not document. This is the thing the quarantine section preserves, though it does not know that is what it is preserving. The researcher wrote, in the 2020 report, what the quarantine section documents is not a supernatural event. It is a failure of the apparatus's categories to account for what it was observing. The observation team members saw something they could not explain. The thing they could not explain was a woman using knowledge and discipline, and a specific inherited practice, to resist the force of something that the apparatus had summoned without knowing it was summoning it. And the something was real in the sense that multiple independent observers documented it consistently over a period of years. And the resistance was successful in the sense that Vera Cobb walked to the bus stop in the autumn of 1978 without composing herself, which was a freedom she had earned through 5 years of the hardest kind of work, by refusing to give the looking what the looking wanted. The researcher noted, "I do not have a category for this in the standard academic apparatus. I am placing it in the report anyway, because the record must exist somewhere, because the record of what Vera Cobb did is as important as the record of what was done to Vera Cobb, and the file as it exists documents the second without knowing the first. This account is the first. From the personal account of Vera Cobb, 1981. I am writing this down because I want the record to be complete. The record of what was done to me is in the file, or in what the file will eventually be required to release, if the law does what the law sometimes does, which is to eventually compel the apparatus to show its work. What was done to me can be documented. It is documented. The selection, the photograph, the newspaper, the surveillance, the political speeches, the 47 pieces of coverage reaching 40 million people, the 5 years of following. It is in the file. When the file is released, it will be there. What the file does not contain is what I am writing here. I am writing here that I survived it. I am writing here that my mother came from Memphis in March of 1973 and sat in my kitchen and did the work she had come to do and taught me what she had been taught and what her mother had been taught. The specific discipline and the specific knowledge and the specific practice of the tradition that has been keeping women like me alive in the middle of forces designed to make women like me not survivable. I am writing that I held at the threshold what pressed at the threshold for 5 years, and that in the autumn of 1978 I walked to the bus stop without composing myself, and the ordinary morning was ordinary, and that was its own form of victory, and I know what to call it, which is survival, and I know who to thank for it, which is my mother and her mother and every woman in my line who kept the knowledge alive in the specific way that essential knowledge survives, not in files, not in official records, not in the apparatus of documentation that institutions maintain for their own purposes, but in the tradition, in the passing from woman to woman, in the kitchen and the threshold and the morning words, and the careful maintenance of the things my mother put at the doors. The file on Vera Cobb will tell you what was done to me. I have told you what I did about it. Both are the record. The record must be complete.